So let me start this one with a question, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. When was the last time you picked up your phone without meaning to? Not because it rang, not because you got a notification, but just because your hand reached for it like it had a mind of its own while you were in line at the coffee shop, or stopped at a red light, or lying in bed at 11:30 at night telling yourself just 5 more minutes. If you're honest, it probably happened today, maybe even in the last hour, and that little unconscious reach is the starting point for one of the biggest arguments of our time. Because here's what I want to push back on right from the jump. The fact that something is compelling, the fact that something captures our attention, doesn't automatically make it dangerous. Billions of people use social media every day to stay connected with family, to build communities, to organize movements that have literally toppled dictatorships, and I think we need to wrestle with the full picture before we start talking about how it's destroying us.
And I appreciate you starting there, because I actually agree that the picture is complicated. But let me paint the other side of it for you, because I don't think the word destroying is as dramatic as it sounds. The average teenager checks their phone roughly 100 times a day, and I want you to sit with that number for a second and think about what it means for a developing brain. We're talking about a 15-year-old whose prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that handles impulse control, long-term planning, understanding consequences, won't be fully developed until they are about 25 years old. That's a full decade away. So we've essentially handed the most sophisticated persuasion technology ever built to people whose brains are neurologically incapable of fully resisting it. And then when they develop anxiety and depression at record rates, we act surprised and tell them to just put the phone down. That's like handing a kid a slot machine and then blaming them for gambling. And that slot machine comparison isn't just a metaphor. It's practically a design document. Let me walk you through the mechanics of what's actually happening in these apps, because I think most people use them every day without understanding how deliberately they've been engineered to be irresistible. You know that little pull to refresh gesture you do on Instagram or Twitter? That's borrowed directly from the mechanics of a slot machine. It's called a variable reward pattern, where sometimes you pull down and there's a great new post waiting for you, and sometimes there's nothing interesting, and that unpredictability is precisely what makes it compulsive. The red notification dots, the infinite scroll that never hits a natural stopping point, the way the app opens to something slightly different every time, none of that is accidental. These features were designed by teams of engineers and psychologists whose explicit job was to maximize the amount of time you spend in the app, and they succeeded beyond anyone's wildest nightmares. Facebook's own internal research, their own researchers, not outside critics, found that Instagram made body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls. 1 in 3. They knew this, they documented it, and they kept right on optimizing for engagement.
Okay, so let me take that apart a little bit, because you're mixing together some things that I think deserve to be separated. First, on the design patterns, yes, pull to refresh and notification dots are designed to capture attention. You know what else is designed to capture attention? The cliffhanger at the end of a TV episode, the chapter break in a thriller novel, the way a newspaper puts the most dramatic headline above the fold. Every form of media in human history has been designed to be as engaging as possible, and we didn't declare an emergency when page turners were invented. Second, on the Facebook internal research, I've actually read those leaked documents carefully, and what they actually show is more nuance than the headlines suggest. The finding was that among girls who already had body image issues, Instagram sometimes made those feelings worse. That's a real finding and it deserves attention, but it's a very different claim than Instagram causes body image problems. And I think the distinction matters, because if we misdiagnose the problem, we're going to build the wrong solutions.
See, and this is where I think that it's just like books and TV argument completely falls apart, and I want to explain why with a really specific comparison. Your uncle has a conspiracy theory about, I don't know, the moon landing or fluoride in the water. At Thanksgiving dinner, he can share that theory with maybe 12 people sitting around the table, and most of them are going to roll their eyes and pass the cranberry sauce, and that's the end of it. Natural social friction contains the spread of bad ideas. Now put that same uncle on Facebook and give him the ability to reach 12 million people, and suddenly we're in a completely different universe. The printing press is the comparison tech optimists always reach for. People panicked about the printing press too. And sure, they did. But you know what also happened after the printing press? A century of religious wars and propaganda on a scale that had never been possible before. The technology did eventually lead to an enlightenment, but it took 200 years and millions of dead people to get there. So forgive me if I'm not super reassured by the historical parallels.
That's actually a really fair point about scale, and I'm not going to pretend the amplification factor doesn't change things, because it does. But I want to offer a different set of stories, because I think we sometimes get so caught up in the doom narrative that we forget what this technology has actually made possible. The Arab Spring, whatever you think about how those revolutions ultimately turned out, was organized in large part through Facebook and Twitter by people living under genuine authoritarian regimes who had no other way to coordinate. The Me Too movement gave millions of women a platform to share experiences that had been systematically silenced for decades, and it fundamentally changed how our society thinks about power and accountability. Those aren't trivial things, those are historic shifts in human organization and justice, and they happened because social media gave ordinary people a megaphone that previously only belonged to the powerful. You can't just ignore that side of the ledger, because the same tool also amplifies your uncle's moon landing theories.
But here's where it goes from being a neutral amplifier to something genuinely corrosive. And I think this is the most important part of the whole conversation. Researchers at NYU did this fascinating study where they looked at how Facebook's algorithm decides what to show you. And what they found was that the algorithm systematically promoted content that triggered outrage. Not because Mark Zuckerberg sat in a room and said, "Let's make people angry," but because angry people engage more. They click, they comment, they share, they come back to see if anyone responded to their angry comment. And all of that engagement is what the algorithm is optimized to produce. So you end up with this perverse feedback loop, where the most divisive, inflammatory, emotionally manipulative content rises to the top not because it's true or important, but because it makes people feel something intense enough to keep scrolling. The algorithm doesn't know the difference between righteous anger and manufactured rage. And frankly, it doesn't care. It just knows that outrage keeps you on the platform. And keeping you on the platform is the only thing it was built to do.
So here's what's interesting about that NYU research, because there's actually a follow-up that I think complicates the story in a really important way. Researchers ran experiments where they switched users from the algorithmic feed back to a simple chronological feed, just showing you posts in the order they were made, no algorithm picking what you see. And what they found was that users on the chronological feed were actually slightly less polarized in their views, which supports your point. And this is the key part, their overall engagement with the platform stayed roughly the same. They spent about the same amount of time scrolling, they just encountered a slightly less inflammatory mix of content. What that tells me is that the algorithm is a real problem worth fixing, but the underlying human desire to connect and consume and share, that's not something Facebook invented. They exploited a pre-existing need. And if we're going to fix this, we need to be honest that the demand side of this equation is just as important as the supply side. You can change the algorithm, but you can't change the fact that humans are social animals who crave stimulation and connection.
And I'd agree that the algorithm is fixable in theory, but let me ask you this: who's going to fix it? Because the companies that build these algorithms make money when you're angry and engaged, not when you're calm and informed. Every dollar of advertising revenue that flows into these platforms is tied to attention, and outrage captures attention better than nuance. So you're essentially asking these companies to voluntarily make their product less profitable. And I've been on this planet long enough to know that corporations do not voluntarily reduce their own profits out of the goodness of their hearts. That's not cynicism, that's just history.
You're not wrong about the incentive structure, and this is where I think regulation has a genuine role to play. I'm not arguing for the status quo, I'm arguing against the idea that social media is some uniquely apocalyptic force that's fundamentally different from every communication technology that came before it. We regulated radio after people figured out you could use it for propaganda. We regulated television after people realized you could use it to manipulate children. We'll regulate social media too, and we should, But we should do it with surgical precision rather than moral panic, because moral panic leads to bad policy, and bad policy tends to hurt the exact people it's trying to protect.
So here's where I think you and I actually end up on the same side of this thing. And it's the part that matters most. Whatever we think about adults making informed choices to scroll through their feeds, and I have my doubts about how informed those choices really are. I think we both have to agree that children are in a fundamentally different category. A 13-year-old does not have the neurological capacity to make a free and informed decision about whether to expose themselves to an endless stream of algorithmically curated content, designed by some of the smartest engineers on the planet to be maximally addictive. We don't let 13-year-olds gamble. We don't let them buy cigarettes. We don't let them sign contracts. And the reason we don't is because we recognize as a society that kids need protection from things they are not yet equipped to handle. I genuinely do not understand why we treat social media differently. And I think in 20 years we're going to look back on this period the way we look back on the era when doctors prescribed cigarettes, with absolute disbelief that we let it happen.
And look, this is the thing that frustrates me about how this debate usually goes. Because people assume that if you're pro-technology, you must be fine with 12-year-olds doom-scrolling TikTok until 2 in the morning, and that's just not where I am. I think kids need protection online, full stop. I think age verification should be robust. I think algorithmic recommendations should be turned off for minors. I think parents need better tools. And I think companies that knowingly design addictive features targeting teenagers should face real consequences. Where I differ from you is that I think we can protect kids without burning the whole thing to the ground. Social media has given a voice to isolated LGBTQ teenagers in small towns who had no one to talk to. It's connected kids with rare diseases to others who understand what they're going through. It's given young activists a platform to organize around climate change and gun violence in ways that were literally impossible a generation ago. The tool isn't the problem. The unregulated, profit-maximized, algorithmically turbocharged version of the tool is the problem, and those are different things.
I hear you, and I agree that there are genuine benefits for young people, especially isolated and marginalized kids who find community online. But I keep coming back to the scale of the harm. We're not talking about a few kids having a rough time. We're talking about an entire generation that is experiencing anxiety, depression, loneliness, and self-harm at rates that have no precedent in the history of modern psychology. And the inflection point maps almost perfectly onto the moment smartphones and social media became ubiquitous in adolescent life. Correlation isn't causation, I know, but at some point the correlation gets so strong and so consistent across so many studies and so many countries that the burden of proof shifts. At some point, you have to stop saying, "We need more research," and start saying, "We need to act now while we figure out the details."
And I think we should act now. I just think act means thoughtful regulation, better design standards, real age verification, and honest public education. Not this vague notion that social media is a poison that needs to be eliminated. Because here's my real worry. If we frame this as social media is destroying our children, we're going to get blunt, heavy-handed policies that restrict the legitimate benefits along with the harms. And the kids who most need the connection and community that these platforms provide are going to be the ones who suffer most from those restrictions. The kids in small towns, the kids with disabilities, the kids whose identities aren't accepted by the people around them. Those are the kids who benefit most from being able to reach beyond their physical circumstances. And I don't want to take that away from them in the name of protecting them.
So where does that leave us? Because I think we've actually circled around to something approaching common ground, which honestly surprises me a little bit. We both agree that children need stronger protections. We both agree that algorithmic amplification of outrage is a real problem. We both agree that there are genuine, meaningful benefits to social connectivity. Where we differ is really about the magnitude of the crisis and the urgency of the response. And I think I land on the side of this is a 5-alarm fire that requires immediate, aggressive action, while you're more in the this is a serious problem that requires careful, measured reform. I hope you're right and I'm wrong. I really do. But I keep thinking about those teenage girls, 1 in 3, And I can't shake the feeling that being measured is a luxury we're buying with their well-being.
And I respect that urgency genuinely, because you're right that real people are hurting right now, and let's study it some more isn't a satisfying answer when your kid is suffering. I just want to make sure that in our urgency we don't lose sight of what makes this technology genuinely extraordinary, the ability to connect any human being on the planet to any other human being. To build communities that transcend geography and class and all the other barriers that have divided us for all of human history. That's not nothing. That's actually one of the most remarkable things our species has ever built, and I think we owe it to ourselves to fix it rather than fear it. Regulate the algorithms, protect the kids, hold the companies accountable, but don't let the panic convince you that connection itself is the enemy.
Then let's end there. Protect the kids first. That's not controversial. That shouldn't be partisan. That should just be obvious. Fix the algorithm second, because the outrage machine is corroding our ability to talk to each other. And third, demand transparency from the companies that profit from our attention, because you cannot make informed choices about a product whose inner workings are deliberately hidden from you. If we can do those three things, maybe this technology really does become the force for good that you believe it can be. But until we do those three things, I'm going to keep worrying.
Fair enough, I'll keep pushing for the future and you keep demanding we earn it. That's probably the healthiest tension we could ask for.